Project 2025 is a startlingly authoritarian form of the U.S. government.
What is Project 2025?
An ultra-conservative agenda.
The fascist playbook.
Trump has distanced himself from Project 2025.
Trump is Project 2025.
The two words, Project 2025.
Policy is noise. Operations are signal. Policy doesn't determine value. Time does. So hold what's real. Let everything else breathe, and when the next cycle comes, you'll know who played the long game. If you own commercial real estate, especially in Virginia, you need to understand what's in it, not because it's good or bad, because it's operational. Right now, there's a policy framework being circulated, Project 2025. So what does this actually mean for your property? Let's break it down asset by asset. Most investors think politics doesn't touch property. They're wrong. Because every lease, every permit, every tax structure, it all runs through policy. And then policy shifts. The plumbing breaks. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily, in ways most people won't notice until the invoice arrives. Right now, there's a policy framework being circulated, Project 2025. You've probably heard the name, maybe ignored it, but if you own commercial real estate, especially in Virginia, you need to understand what's in it, not because it's good or bad, because it's operational. This isn't about left or right, it's about leverage, liquidity, and lag time. It's about what happens when the rules rewrite themselves in 18 months and your deal was underwritten for 30 years. So let's talk about what actually changes. Not the talking points, not the headlines, the mechanics. Because in commercial real estate, the only question that matters is this: does your asset still work when the subsidy stops? Project 2025 is a roadmap. 900 pages of proposed policy changes across federal agencies. Most of it doesn't matter to us, but some of it does. Here's what's relevant if you own property. The federal workforce reduction, the framework proposes cutting federal employment by 10 to 15%, relocating agencies, consolidating offices. That matters a lot. If you're in Richmond, Northern Virginia, or Hampton Roads, because federal tenants aren't just stable, they're structural. Regulatory rollback, environmental reviews, zoning approvals, permitting timelines. The proposal accelerates them, removes friction. Sounds good, until you realize faster permitting means faster supply, and faster supply means compression. Tax policy shifts, changes to depreciation schedules, potential adjustments to 1031 exchanges, carried interest treatment. None of this is finalized, but all of it impacts your cost of capital. HUD and fair housing enforcement. The framework suggests decentralizing enforcement, reducing federal oversight on local housing policy. That means cities and states get more control, which means more variance, more complexity. And here's the thing: I'm not telling you this is good or bad. I'm telling you it's material, because in commercial real estate, material changes create repricing events, and repricing events separate the patient from the desperate. So let's start with the most immediate pressure point: tenants. In Richmond, roughly 12% of the workforce is federal or federally adjacent. In Hampton Roads, it's closer to 20%. Northern Virginia, 30% in some submarkets. Now imagine 10% of that employment disappears. Not over a decade, over 2 budget cycles. What happens? Office buildings in submarkets anchored by federal tenants start to leak, not catastrophically, but steadily. Renewal rates drop, TI requests increase, downtime between leases stretch from 6 months to 12. And here's the problem: private sector tenants can't absorb that velocity. Because they're not expanding, they're consolidating. Multifamily feels it differently. Federal employees tend to rent near installations, near offices, near bases, and if those jobs relocate or vanish, apartments lose their demand anchor. So not immediately, but over 18 months, occupancy softens, concessions creep in. Retail feels it fast because retail follows spending, and spending follows paychecks. If your shopping center is in a submarket with 15% federal employment, and that drops to 10, your in-line tenants notice. Foot traffic thins, sales per square foot compress, and when the leases come up for renewal, the negotiations get harder. Now, some of you are thinking this is speculation, and you're right. But here's what's not speculation. Federal agencies have already started consolidating. GSA has been shrinking its footprint for years. This policy framework doesn't create the trend, it accelerates it. In commercial real estate, acceleration is risk, because deals are slow, repositioning takes time, capital is patient, until it isn't. If you own office with federal tenant exposure, you're not facing catastrophe. You're facing mark-to-market reality, and the market is repricing faster than your lease terms allow you to react. Here's what most people miss about policy. It doesn't create demand, it shapes velocity. Take ESG mandates. For the last 5 years, institutional capital has priced in environmental compliance. LEED certification, energy benchmarking, carbon reporting, not because investors care about the planet, though some do, because tenants care, and tenants drive value. Now, if the federal ESG mandates relax, if enforcement softens, does that value disappear? Not immediately, because corporate tenants still want green buildings. Tech companies, law firms, healthcare systems, they're not waiting for Washington to tell them what to lease. But here's the shift. If compliance becomes voluntary, uncertified buildings become competitive again. The premium for LEED shrinks, the gap between Class A and Class B narrows, and suddenly, that repositioning project you underwrote at a 4 cap, it's a 4.5 cap. Same logic applies to zoning. If permitting timelines compress, if environmental reviews get streamlined, developers can deliver faster. Sounds great, right? Except faster delivery means more supply, and more supply means compression. Industrial is already seeing this. Spec development is outpacing absorption in secondary markets. If policy removes friction, that trend accelerates. And here's the paradox. Regulation creates scarcity. Scarcity creates value. Remove the regulation and you remove the moat. I'm not saying regulation is good or bad. I'm saying it's structural. And when structure shifts, value migrates from assets that relied on policy to assets that never needed it. Because the best properties, the ones that survive every cycle, they don't depend on subsidy. They don't depend on tax breaks or mandates or federal tenants. They depend on location, operations, and fundamentals. And when policy changes, those are the only things left standing. So what does this actually mean for your property? Let's break it down asset by asset. Office. If you own Class B office in a submarket with federal tenant concentration, Richmond, Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, you're facing refinancing risk. Not today, but in 24 to 36 months. Because if occupancy drops 5 to 10% and TI costs rise, your NOI compresses. And when your bridge loan matures, the refi conversation gets uncomfortable. Lenders will underwrite to lower occupancy, higher cap rates, tighter debt service coverage, which means either more equity or a sale. Multifamily. Housing policy changes hit differently. If fair housing enforcement decentralizes, cities gain more discretion on zoning and tenant protections. That's good news in pro-development markets. Bad news in slow growth, higher regulation metros. Tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, could see changes in allocation or oversight. If federal oversight tightens, some states will expand programs. Others will tighten, which means geographic arbitrage becomes more pronounced. And if you're underwriting workforce housing and submarkets dependent on federal employment, you're watching occupancy more closely than rent growth. Industrial. This is where deregulation could bite. Faster permitting equals more spec development equals oversupply in tertiary markets. We're already seeing it in the Southeast. Industrial vacancy ticking up in markets that overbuilt during the e-commerce boom. If policy removes environmental review, that acceleration continues. And if operators who build for speed, not durability, get stuck holding empty boxes. Now let's talk about opportunity zones. They were supposed to sunset, then extended. Now there's talk of either expanding them or letting them expire. If you develop capital into an OZ fund, your exit timeline just became political. And here's the reality. Policy uncertainty doesn't kill deals, but widens bid-ask spreads. Because sellers want yesterday's value, buyers underwrite for tomorrow's risk. And the gap between them, that's where liquidity dies. So if you're sitting on an asset that penciled at acquisition, but feels tight today, you're not alone. You're just early to the repricing. So here's what I tell every client I work with. Policy is noise. Operations are signal. Because the properties that survive policy swings, the ones that thrive through administrations, recessions, rate cycles, they all have one thing in common. They never needed subsidy to work. They weren't underwritten for tax breaks. They weren't leased to tenants to exist because of federal spending. They weren't financed assuming rates stayed low forever. They were underwritten for permanence, location, occupancy, rent coverage, debt structure, the boring stuff. The stuff that doesn't make headlines. So when Washington rewrites the rules, and it will every few years, regardless of party, ask yourself one question. Does this asset still make sense without them? If the answer is yes, you're fine. If the answer is no, you're holding on to someone else's problem. And the market quietly, patiently will reprice the problem until someone with more capital and more patience takes it off your hands. Because in the end, policy doesn't determine value, time does. And the operators who understand that, who build for decades, not elections, they're the ones still standing when the noise fades. So hold what's real, let everything else breathe, and when the next cycle comes, and it will, you'll know who played the long game.